Welcome back. Interesting conversations we've had there with PDP chieftain Bode George, as well as former NBA chairman and a lawyer, Olisa Agbakoba. Very interesting conversations we've had. We've looked at the opposition party's position regarding the past 365 days in office, as well as the judiciary's role in all of this. We're still going to be looking more into the past 1 year in office, and we're joined by social commentator and analyst, Ayo Adio. Good morning. Good to have you here.
Good morning.
Happy 1 year. I don't even know how to couch this greeting.
Happy inauguration.
Happy inauguration anniversary.
Same to you.
All right. We'll be looking at one or two papers to see what the front pages are saying this morning and see if there are any headlines that point to what exactly it is we're doing. The Vanguard newspaper this morning, the big story says, strike looms as minimum wage talks end in deadlock again. And that's the only paper we're going to be reviewing this morning. The big story says strike looms, and it's not looking good. The writer there says federal government OPS add 3,000 naira to earlier offer. Labour challenges government to break down offer. Nationwide strike appears inevitable in June. Organized labor's demand may endanger job security, according to OPS. Federal government now has enough to clear debts, according to Wale Edun. Biafra Day, IPOB insists on May 30 sit-at-home in the southeast. 2026 WCQ, Osimhen out of South Africa Benin Games. And then at the top of the paper, we have 6 things Tinubu must do to succeed, according to Atiku. I like the opposition. They are really speaking up very strongly. Kano Emirates tussle, courts give conflicting orders on Sanusi's removal. And the final story there, 365 days on, Tinubu's bitter sweet run. Okay. So I think we'll come back to the conversation about the past 365 days, but I think it all it's woven, it's interwoven, they sort of intermarry. The NLC, the TUC, there have been conversations with the government regarding the minimum wage, and now we're seeing that they've come to a deadlock. They started off with a figure that many refer to as not logical, because not necessarily because labor doesn't deserve that or Nigerian workers don't deserve that. But we're looking at what the government can afford, logically. So there's been back and forth, and now we're at a deadlock.
Well, unsurprisingly so, because you have to look at it from a broad perspective. First, the average Nigerian worker earns the least in the world, only better than Bangladesh. So we have essentially the poorest workers in the entire world, and that doesn't speak so well for our country, given the size of our economy and the size of our GDP. So to that extent, you would argue that the labor unions have a point, saying that they want better wages, essentially to take wages away from the floor. On the flip side of it, obviously, is the fact that the amounts that the labor unions are demanding, over 610,000, now reviewed to 80,000 naira, is a bit unrealistic. And the reason simply is, if you push that economy, if you pay that amount to workers across the country, you're going to push forward inflation. And the reality is, many states cannot afford to pay that amount. Just last week, Zamfara were celebrating the fact that their governor decided to pay 30,000 naira minimum wage. So it's still a big party that governors are willing to pay 30,000 naira a month. And now you want to raise that ceiling to about 480. It's a bit, the labor unions are a bit guilty of living in the clouds, if you'd like. So I think there has to be a realistic and pragmatic approach to dealing with these wage issues. I understand that inflation is high, but a more realistic number would be between 70,000 to 90,000 naira.
So when you're talking about realistic, are you talking about what the average Nigerian requires to exist for a month? Are you talking about what figures a living wage should be, or you're talking about what is possible for the Nigerian government to pay?
Well, I'm looking at all of them put together. Now, again, let me be very honest. The Nigerian government are not helping themselves in this argument, because one of the reasons why the labor unions are a bit stubborn is the fact that you can't tell me that it's impossible to pay a living wage and you're riding the latest SUVs. You can't tell me that you can't afford to pay me a certain amount of money and you're flying first class in private jets. Now, I'm not sure there are any elite class in the world. If you looked at social media, and you saw a typical gathering of politicians, or when one politician is going to visit another politician, what you see first are a show of SUVs. What you see are opulence, people showing how much they have arrived. You see them arriving from the airport from a private jet, and you see them with the latest SUV exchanging pleasantries. So there's this flagrant display of wealth that, betrays a lack of sensitivity of what the average Nigerian is going through. And you cannot be negotiating from that point of view and expect the labor unions to have the short end of the stick, which is why I've always argued that our politicians must commit class suicide. You can't continue to be the highest end politicians in the world, and your country essentially is living in abject poverty. We essentially are a factory for manufacturing poor people in the world. Nigeria has arguably the highest amount of poor people per capita in the entire world. It makes absolutely no sense. Unemployment is high, poverty is continuing to rise, there's no end in sight, and politicians continue to live such extravagant, their appetite is just unending.
Whatever happened to the Oransari report? There was a lot of clown and excitement about it when, the government did say that it should be implemented, set up a committee to ensure implementation within 12 weeks. I don't know that we have as much.
There's obviously a difference between policy articulation and the intention to pursue a policy and the reality on ground. Obviously, there's been a lot of policy pronouncement, but it's hardly been followed, by activities, the pragmatism, the strategic discipline necessary to drive these policies to fruition. We really haven't seen that. So you've had a lot of policy somersaults, you've had a lot of inconsistency, and worse off, it's like you have a lot of ministries working at cross purposes, and they are not achieving any desired results, such that 1 year into office, there's still a lot of promises and very little results to show for the level of investments that have gone in the last 1 year. And that really worries me. It's just like a university student who starts his academic year. If you miss your year one and you're aiming to make first class, it becomes almost impossible, right? And that's where we are now. If you've not made the most out of the first year in office, you put yourself in a very difficult position, because you know that the fourth year is usually for politicking, and it's a completely wasted year. And essentially, you just have 2 years.
Actually, from the third year.
Exactly. So you have a lot of political permutation. So for me, the first year is usually the year you lay that foundation, you set the tone, you set the direction, you mobilize support, and you steer the country in the direction with which you want it to go. Unfortunately, it's still topsy-turvy. We're still playing Russian roulette, if you like, and we're not making real progress.
But there's people who, have had their own analysis on ministers, and how to rate them. They've rated Nyesom Wike, the minister of the FCT, really high. Rated the minister of works, Dave Umahi, and a couple of other people, like exactly Tunjojo, and what's the other guy's name? Can't remember.
You're struggling to even name 5 out of 40 plus ministers.
But that's mostly. I mean, Ali Pate did, share a couple of things that they achieved with health. He pointed out, some funding that has now been released. A couple of, some figures with regards to primary health care, accessibility and all of that, how they've also recruited more people to join the healthcare workforce, to tackle, Jagba, and those who have the brain drain. Those were some of the things that they pointed out. So I'm sure that the average Nigerian would also struggle to name, these ministries, and, because a lot of them are irrelevant, in the average Nigerian life. Do you agree with the ratings? Nyesom Wike, Dave Umahi, and Olabumi Tunjojo and a few others. So the Minister of Power, Delabu, will be on the bottom.
So I don't think you can look at these ministries in isolation. I mean, if you're talking about behind the scenes, when the president wants to have a handshake with his best performing ministers, then you can do that. But they have to work as a collective for you to judge the progress of the administration. And while you have pointed out 3 or 4 ministers who seem to be moving the needle a bit, collectively they have been underwhelming. And that really is the problem. And, I have always argued that you don't have state capacity to do too many things at the same time, right? And you don't have enough resources to effectively change a lot of fundamentals across the various sectors of the economy. And have argued consistently that the government needs to have a clear focus on what the state is going to intervene in and leave what the private sector is going to do in the other aspects. And so for me, if the state can focus strategically on agriculture, driving productivity, dealing with food security, and of course, focus on dealing with national security issues, and perhaps a few other macroeconomic fundamentals, then we're likely to make a lot more progress. But we seem to be trying to do too many things at the same time, and making very little movement at the end of the day.
Yeah.
And you see, the most fair and balanced way to judge this administration is to judge them by the promises that they made to the Nigerian people and by the commitments that they have made for themselves and the goals and objectives that they have set in place. And I give you 3 examples. Their documents clearly said that they wanted to grow the economy by an average of 8 to 10% consistently over 4 years, right? You're growing your GDP now at less than 3%. So on that scorecard, you have failed to meet the mark.
I mean, even if you laid out the 8-point agenda, there's none of them that you can actually give a pass
So that's what I'm
Well,
saying. You have to judge them by that agenda. And if you put the metrics and you put out their scorecard, you will see that the only thing that they have done significantly based on the promises that they made was that, yes, they were going to reform the oil and gas sector. They obviously said they were going to push bold reforms in terms of monetary policy. They have removed petrol subsidies. They have done these things. But the truth
Even though that is still debatable.
Yes,
Yeah.
of course, we have argued that the sequencing of those policies have probably hurt us more than it has benefited us.
Yeah.
But at the end of the
Because-
day,
yeah.
you have to judge them by the promises that they made.
And
if you put that
I
scorecard
just
there
want you to quickly, because we're going to go back to our, NIJ students here. So I want you to just quickly, score 0 to 10. Food security.
I mean, the number speaks for itself. 40% inflation, not working for me.
So
So it is what it is.
no, give a mark.
It's bad. I mean, I would say 2 because people are extremely hungry.
Poverty eradication.
Of course, 2.
Economic growth and job creation.
Exactly.
Job creation, 2. Economic growth, 5. Because again, you can see that the numbers are slightly moving in a positive direction. Yeah.
Okay, access to capital.
I mean, extremely poor because interest rates have gone high, which has made capital more expensive and stifling manufacturing, construction, and small businesses. So that's really, really poor,
Yeah.
given the fact that
And rule of law and fighting corruption.
absolutely abysmal, and especially the rule of law. And that worries me the most because we now live in a country where it looks like judicial decisions are things that you can acquire as though you were going to a shopping mall, right?
Yeah.
And the case of Kanu, buttresses this point where there's clear judicial precedents where, state governments are squarely responsible for chieftaincy matters, and you have conflicting judgments from the Federal High Court.
And the state courts.
I mean, it's in many cases, even with the way Godwin Emefiele's case was handled,
Yes, yes.
how he was held before he was brought before a court of committed jurisdiction, held for days.
Yeah.
Even though there's a constitutional provision for how you should do a lot of that. I mean, these are conversations that are unending. I'm sure that we'll revisit these conversations over and over again until the 12th of June is when we have the official Democracy Day. But Ayo Adio, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you so much.
All right.